When you look at these games, you can probably tell that they aren't actually from the era they remind you of, and you can probably pinpoint why. Maybe it's the presence of dynamic lighting, or higher poly models than older hardware could reasonably run, or certain stylistic choices that weren't exactly common at the time. These are all newer titles, released in 2020 or later, a time when games can look like this. But these games are new in a very particular way. The style has become somewhat synonymous with the independent game development scene, works that draw from the language of 5th generation console titles, especially in the survival horror genre, but executed in ways that feel familiar, yet different. Nostalgic even. But nostalgic for what exactly? Many of the people making these games weren't even old enough to remember or experience this era of games growing up. So why is it that we feel this longing for a past that we never lived through? The term nostalgia was originally coined all the way back in the 17th century by Dr. Johannes Hofer, as a medical condition referring to the sad mood originating from the desire to return to one's native land. In other words, homesickness. Since then, the word's meaning has shifted into something much stranger, a state or feeling of melancholy that's involuntary, yet somehow desired. In the book The Future of Nostalgia by Svetlana Boym, Boym separates nostalgia into two different types. Restorative nostalgia, which I can best describe as the desire to time travel, back to a time and place exactly as we remember it. However, since doing that currently isn't possible, we instead attempt to recreate that past with painstaking detail, as faithfully to memory as possible. Within video games, the closest I can think of are remasters and remakes. The same games you remember, perhaps with newly added features and higher fidelity graphics, but ultimately an attempt to recapture the original experience. While some remakes transform their source material quite significantly, they still utilize the same characters, same narrative, and recognizable locations. The work pulls you back to that familiar place. But the games I've been showing aren't based of any existing IP. What they have in common is something much less tangible. They may be similar in appearance or gameplay, but what actually connects them is a shared vocabulary. We can't restore something that never actually existed in the first place. This is where reflective nostalgia comes in. Instead of going back in time, we reach out to it, present day, present time. And what comes back isn't a snapshot, it's an impression. A past filtered through a lens, reinterpreted, and misremembered, essentially a false memory. Take the work of Puppet Combo. On the surface, these games may look period accurate, with fixed camera angles, low poly models, and texture work, reminiscent of games from the PlayStation 1. It's tempting to call that restorative, but upon closer inspection, these works also pull from other places. Puppet Combo's FAQ page notes that while their games do draw from early 3D survival horror, the aim was never to replicate, but to create new experiences shaped by the slasher genre of film. If the work were truly restorative, it would sit in a paradoxical position, wearing the look of the past while being something that could only have been built within a contemporary setting. This is what I refer to as the nostalgic present. SIGNALIS, on the other hand, makes this impulse very clear. It isn't period accurate, nor is it ever trying to be. The game utilizes familiar survival horror conventions such as the limited inventory, puzzles, and level design, but with the top-down camera perspective, anime-inspired character designs, and pixel art aesthetics, making it clear it isn't attempting to return to any singular time. As developer Barbara Whitman states, that while the game's references enrich the overall experience, the game functions perfectly fine if you don't recognize anything at all. While the work could have only been built with the current tools, sensibilities, and creative perspectives, it ultimately functions as a work that evokes nostalgia without being traceable to any singular source. Voidrot is a puzzle game that I developed that started with the intention of recreating the look of pre-rendered backgrounds from 5th generation console titles, but entirely in real time instead. But what actually makes pre-rendered backgrounds feel nostalgic? Because if you go back and look at how these games were originally experienced, those backgrounds weren't actually considered low resolution at the time. They were created to fit with the original resolutions that the game ran at, which blended reasonably well with the characters moving through them. Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil, describes how the team wanted the game to be fully 3D. However, due to the technical limitations at the time, they instead opted to utilize pre-rendered graphics to achieve the higher graphical fidelity that they were looking for. But what I'm doing here is the complete opposite. There is a deliberate attempt to make the game lower fidelity, limiting the game to a 4:3 aspect ratio, downscaling the overall image, limiting the frame rate, and adding a ton of sharpness. However, this isn't how these images were originally perceived or experienced, with elements like the increase in sharpness being a property of digital restoration rather than something that was actually utilized in that specific era of games. Reflecting on these early experiments made me realize that while I thought I was chasing authenticity, I had simply been looking through that same filtered lens that I had described earlier, chasing a feeling rather than faithful reproduction. Throughout the rest of development, I continued to embrace this approach to reflective nostalgia. The inclusion of a digital camera and its aesthetic qualities break the illusion of a pre-rendered image, but instead replaces it with a completely different nostalgic lens. On the other hand, a game running inside the game itself, with even lower fidelity presentation. Each one is not entirely accurate to what they represent, but put together in a way that feels like a celebration of nostalgia itself. While the artifact has been shaped by the past, it does not become defined by it. Created through a series of false memories yet still evoking the same condition. Ultimately, the nostalgic present isn't longing for any specific point in time, but the misremembering of it itself.